Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the mysterious gravedigger, Coram the Undertaker. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee or through the Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what Commander content we'll be releasing next. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the Commander and playstyle. Coram the Undertaker is an 05 human warrior that costs 1 and a Jund that has the following abilities. Firstly, he gains +X+0, where X is the greatest power among creatures in all graveyards. Secondly, whenever Coram attacks, each player mills a card. And thirdly, during each of our turns, we may play a land and cast a spell from among cards in graveyards that were put there from libraries this turn. Taking a closer look at Coram's core stats, he's sporting a midweight CMC, a non-existent power and average toughness stat block for his cost, and a trio of graveyard-centric abilities that enable him to get cards into the bin and then use them to both empower himself and generate us value. Quickly going over his second ability first, since it does help set up his other two abilities, it simply allows us to repeatedly get more cards into all players' bins, which isn't going to mill anyone out on its own, but it does at least allow him to set up his other two abilities without the need of any outside mill sources, though he will still greatly benefit from having them. Then looking at his first ability, it simply allows him to mirror the highest power among all creatures in all graveyards, whether that be any gigantic beatsticks with naturally high power, or creatures whose stats scale through some outside source, which do in fact still scale while in the bin for the purposes of this effect, thereby augmenting Coram's non-existent starting power into a serious threat, provided of course we can get those high power creatures into our bin reliably. And last, but certainly not least, his third ability functionally serves as a pseudo-draw 2, enabling us to make our land drop and cast a single spell from any bin each rotation, so long as the cards in question were sent there from their owner's deck that turn, potentially allowing us to play and cast our opponent's milled lands and spells if we opt to go in a more traditional mill-focused direction, but I personally find that it synergizes much better with the wide array of self-mill and graveyard tutoring effects our colors have at their disposal to help generate us much more consistent and reliable value outside of traditional draw. So, as we can see based on his effects, Coram is clearly a commander that cares about the graveyard, both in the aspect of getting big creatures into the bin by any means to empower himself, and milling/tutoring cards into our bin so we can generate value off of them. So it should come as no surprise that we'll be taking this build in a graveyard self-mill focused direction to get the most mileage out of both sides of Coram's kit. As such, we'll be running a wide array of ways to get cards from our deck directly into our bin to maximize our ability to play and cast cards from it, a variety of high-power creatures and creatures that, like Coram, derive their stats from the bin in some fashion in order to both empower Coram and or swing in alongside him, and capping things off with a suite of graveyard recursion sources to work alongside Coram so we can generate the maximum possible value from it, thus enabling Coram to extract every bit of power from his cemetery and then use it to bury our opponents in it. So let us travel to the savage and lawless land of Houston, Texas, the birthplace of Mark William Calloway, who would later become the legendary Undertaker, arguably the greatest professional wrestler of all time. 3-time WWF World Heavyweight Champion, 3-time WWE World Heavyweight Champion, 6-time Tag Team Champion, and with a 21 undefeated win streak at WrestleMania across over 2 decades, The Undertaker has cemented himself as one of the most iconic and recognizable wrestlers to have ever graced the squared circle. And why am I telling you this? It's because Coram has a single line of lore that says he's an Undertaker that's probably from Innistrad. So I'd figured I'd take a moment to learn all you folks about a much more fleshed out Undertaker instead. So, now that we know a bit more about at least one Undertaker and the playstyle of this deck, let's start taking a look at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Kicking things off with our largest category by far, our creature base, we'll be thematically filling up this category to the absolute brim with bodies to build up Coram's cemetery with, ranging from fellow gravediggers and cemetery workers to work alongside Coram to get even more cards into and out of our graveyard, naturally high power bodies, and bodies who become empowered via our graveyard to both augment Coram's strength from the bin and or swing in alongside him, and even a handful of bodies who actively want to be in our bin so they can provide us with some value while they're in there. So, starting with the graveyard-centric portion of our game plan, we'll be adding in a suite of self-mill-centric creatures to our ranks in the form of Nyx Weaver, Old Rutstein, and Splinter Fright, all of which passively mill us on our upkeep to help enable Coram while also providing additional upside, either by functioning as a one-time source of graveyard recursion, generating us creature, blood, and treasure tokens as they mill us for additional board presence, graveyard setup, and ramp, or simply growing in stats alongside our bin as they help grow it, under Realm Lich, which turns all our draw into card selection and graveyard setup by letting us pick a card off the top 3 and sending the rest to our bin every time we would draw, with the added benefit of also being very resilient thanks to its on-demand indestructibility, Stitcher Supplier, and Satyr Wayfinder, both of which serve as cheap bodies that mill us when they ETB, the former doing so again as it dies for even more graveyard setup, and the latter letting us put a milled land into our hand to help us make our land drops, Combustible Gear Hulk, which instead serves as a high-cost source of either self-mill and burn or card advantage as it ETBs for additional value, or that can simply be a 6-power body to empower our commander from the bin if we mill over it, and Skull Prophet, which can function as a mana dork that taps for our 2 most predominant colors to help speed up our mana base with, or as a source of on-tap mill if we need the additional graveyard setup instead. Then adding some graveyard recursion to the mix while staying on the self-mill game plan, we'll be slotting in the Legends Shigeki Jukai Visionary, who initially functions as a repeatable source of self-milling land ramp to help us speed up our mana base and fill up our bin with, that later, thanks to his channel, lets us use him to recur multiple non-legendary cards from our bin back to hand to be used again, along with Six and Kaga Shadow Archdruid, both of whose on-attack mill nets us more cards into our bin while also letting us reoccur said cards with their passives, the former via granting all our permanents retrace to turn our dead land draws into graveyard recursion, and the latter simply letting us play a land or cast a spell, milled or tutored to our bin each rotation to help supplement our commander's graveyard casting. And then on the non-legendary recursion front, we'll be adding in Sludge Titan, whose ETB and on-attack mill 5, ability to recur a creature and a land it mills back into our hand, and its trampling 6/6 stat block make it a fantastic piece of graveyard setup, value, and raw power. Then still staying on the self-mill side of things, but moving on to creatures focused around reanimating cards directly into play rather than getting them back into our hands, we'll be adding in both Aftermath Analyst and World Shaper, both of which get more cards into our bin as they ETB or attack respectively, while also providing mass land reanimation with their abilities to provide us with a massive amount of ramp, as well as the Praetor Vorinclex, whose front face is a decent overstatted body that fetches up non-basic forests to help fix us, but we're really running for his back face, the Grand Evolution, whose mill 10 that reanimates 2 of the milled creatures is fantastic at setting up our graveyard payoffs while building up our board state. The second chapter's +1/+1 counter distribution can make our commander an even harder hitting threat that's even more durable in combat thanks to increasing his toughness alongside his power, and its final chapter turns our entire board into a build-your-own Azuri's Predation that lets our high-power creatures eat our opponent's creatures, which then culminates with flipping Vorinclex back over for even more land fetching and to start the process all over again. Now, switching focus onto a suite of creatures that want to be sent to the bin so they can provide us with value while they're in there, we'll be recruiting Anger and Brawn into our ranks, which grant all our creatures haste and trample respectively from the grave, making our commander and our other high-power creatures even more dangerous, Genesis, which instead gives us the option to recur a creature back to our hand each rotation while it itself is in the grave, enabling us to get back milled over playmakers we were unable to cast with Coram or that were previously destroyed, and Golgari Grave Troll, whose Dredge 6 allows us to get even more cards into our bin so we can recur it back into our hand, and then serves as a resilient beatstick whose stats scale with the amount of creatures we have in our bin as we cast it to swing in alongside Coram. And while on the topic of creatures who can empower themselves through cards in graveyards, we'll be running an entire suite of them to both empower our commander from the bin and or to swing in alongside him while in play, such as Boneyard Worm, Old Stick Fingers, and Boneyard Mycodrax, all of whose stats scale equal to the amount of creatures we have in our graveyard. The second also letting us pump mana into it to dump even more creatures into our bin to further build up our graveyard, while the third lets us scavenge it from the bin to build up Coram's stat block even more. Gerard Golgari Lichlord, who also grows bigger as our graveyard creature count increases, with the added benefits of being able to recur himself back from the grave and letting us sacrifice creatures to him to inflict life loss equal to their power to all our opponents to quickly end games. The Lurgoyfs Lurgoyf, Mordovor, and Necrogoyf, all of whom become stronger as the creature count in any player's graveyard increases, so we can take advantage of our opponent's casualties as well, with the first two increasing in both power and toughness, while the third increases only in power but makes up for it by also being a repeatable source of AoE discard to rip cards out of our opponent's hands and let us set up our bin further. Souls of the Lost, whose stats scale with the number of permanent cards in our graveyard, allowing it to take advantage of our milled over lands and permanent spells outside of our creatures to grow itself, as well as letting us use its additional casting cost to further fill up our bin with cards from our hand or in play. And lastly, Lord of Extinction, which, thanks to its stat scaling equal to the amount of cards in all graveyards, makes it potentially our largest creature to swing in with while in play, and the one most likely to turn Coram into a one-shotting commander damage dealing machine from the graveyard once spins start filling up. And then as a pair of creatures who don't empower themselves, but instead grow our board depending on the contents of our graveyard, we'll be slotting in Blight Titan and Bladewing Deathless Tyrant, the former providing us with additional mill every time it swings in, and then incubating equal to the amount of creatures we have in our bin, easily enabling it to create up to double-digit tokens for us turn after turn to swing in alongside Coram, and the latter instead creating 2/2 zombies equal to the amount of creatures we have in our bin, allowing us to go wide with expendable bodies to screen attacks or simply overwhelm our opponents with raw numbers. And that's in addition to both of them being gigantic beatsticks that can deal out considerable damage in their own right. Now, closing in on the end of the graveyard-centric portion of our creature base, we'll be adding in a trio of legends that care about creatures leaving our graveyard to get a bit more mileage out of our commander's effect and the build's impressive number of recursion and reanimation pieces. Those being Chainer Nightmare Adept, who passively grants haste to all our creatures that we cast or reanimate from the bin so they can swing in as soon as they come down, while also letting us pitch cards from our hand that we'd rather have in our graveyard in order to cast creatures from our graveyard that we'd rather have in play. Sir Conrad the Grim, who turns every single creature who enters or leaves anyone's graveyard into AoE life loss for our opponents to keep whittling down their life totals, in addition to also being a source of AoE mill himself if we have the spare mana to both enable himself and all our other graveyard payoffs. And lastly, Grist Voracious Larva, who only costs a single mana and we can transform quite easily thanks to Coram into her back face, Grist the Plague Swarm, who provides us with more self-mill, back row spot removal, and an impressive graveyard payoff ultimate that creates 1/1 copies of all our creatures in our graveyard, which synergizes particularly well with our graveyard stat deriving creatures by generally making them stronger than the original. And then as our final graveyard-focused creature entrant, we have Eternal Witness, which gives us another piece of graveyard recursion that, while it may not set up our bin itself, can recur anything back from it, and we can easily get extra uses out of it thanks to our solid creature recursion suite to get even more graveyard value that's not just limited to recurring our creatures. So, with the massive graveyard-centric creature portion of our game plan well and truly covered, we'll be rounding out the remainder of our creature base by first adding in a trio of naturally high-power entrants to empower Coram as we get them into our bin without the need to fill up our graveyard first. Those being Titanoth Rex, whose 11/11 trampling stat block is useful in both the graveyard and on the battlefield, while its ability to cycle itself and grant a trample counter to Coram easily allows us to get it into our bin bin to empower our commander while simultaneously making him more dangerous. Galta Primal Hunger, whose 12/12 trampling stat block is even more impressive, and we can easily cast for as little as 2 mana thanks to its cost reduction based on our creature's combined power, which Coram can usually provide all on his own. And finally, Yargle and Multani, who may be just a dumb 18/6 vanilla beatstick, but whose 18 power that it can easily bestow onto Coram on its own from the bin is far too powerful to ignore, easily positioning our commander to two-shot our opponents if we're able to get it into the bin early. And finally, to close out our creature base, we'll be padding our core stats by adding in Caustic Caterpillar, Canker Bloom, and Voracious Varmint as pieces of backer removal on bodies, all of which sack themselves to grow our bin with even more bodies and empower our graveyard-centric payoffs, along with Ignoble Hierarch and Sakura Tribe Elder as some additional ramp sources, the former functioning as a cheap mana dork that taps for all our colors to improve the build's consistency, and the latter being another creature we can sack away to fill our bin, this time to provide us with staple green land ramp to fix and speed up our mana base. That covers the 42 creatures we'll be running in our 99, so let's move on to our instance. Opening our instant category with its only graveyard-centric entrant, we have Grisly Salvage, which generally nets us 4 more cards into our bin and 1 land or creature from among them into our hand to help us further make our land drops, or to keep a playmaker we'd rather not have to recur or reanimate. It's then going to be removal all the way down for the remainder of this category to ensure we can reliably deal with our opponent's threats, in which we'll be running Terminate as a solid piece of cheap creature spot removal in our colors, Bedevil as another piece of creature removal that can also hit walkers and artifacts for additional flexibility, and the permanent removal suite consisting of Assassin's Trophy, Terra Sunder, Beast Within, and Chaos Warp, so that we can efficiently deal with any type of threat our opponents can throw our way. That covers the 7 instants we'll be running, so let's move on to our sorceries. Returning back to graveyard-centric effects as we enter our sorcery category, we'll be adding in the newly reprinted Buried Alive, which is now much more affordable and can set up our bin quite nicely with up to 3 creatures to empower Coram or to cast off of him, as well as the classic Faithless Looting, which lets us pitch cards that we'd rather have in our bin so we can draw extra cards from our deck, and whose flashback lets us cast it from the bin if we mill over it or we simply want to make use of its effect again. Then we'll be wrapping up our sorceries with the fairly typical green land ramp package consisting of Rampant Growth, Farseek, Nature's Lore, Cultivate, and Kodama's Reach, all of which fetch either basic or non-basic lands directly into play to help fix and speed up our 3-color mana base. That covers the 7 sorceries we'll be running, so let's move on to our enchantments. Returning yet again to ways for us to fill up our bin and to generate value from it, we'll be slotting in Cemetery Tampering as a way for us to passively get more cards into our graveyard to help enable Coram and all our other graveyard payoffs. That eventually builds up to a free spell thanks to its graveyard-centric hideaway for some extra value. Ripples of Undeath, which mills us even further and gives us the option to use it as a source of passive card advantage if we mill over playmakers that we'd rather get into our hand if we can't or don't want to cast them off of Coram, and a Deadbridge Chant, which may be mana intensive but does get a lot of resources into our bin for us to make use of as soon as it comes down, and then passively gets us even more spells from our bin back into our hand or into play at no mana cost to help us grind out our opponents. And then to close out this slot with some more core stat-oriented entrants, we'll be adding in Garruk's Uprising, which not only functions as a repeatable source of card advantage as our naturally high power and graveyard stat scaling creatures come down to help keep our hands topped off, but also provides those same creatures with trample to ensure they can reliably get in for damage with those stat blocks, as well as the Saga One Ring to rule them all, which gives our build a board wipe that dodges our commander and our surprisingly large amount of legendary creatures, while also providing more AoE mill that scales off our most powerful creature in play to further set up our bin, and a graveyard-centric AoE life loss effect to soften up our opponents with. That covers the 5 enchantments we'll be running, so let's move on to our artifacts. We'll be keeping our artifacts nice and simple this time around, with this category consisting of only the Mana Rock, Soul Ring, and Arcane Signet, both of which provide us with some more stable ramp to help bolster the build's already impressive ramp package and ensure we can get to our higher CMC spells as quickly as possible. That covers the 2 artifacts we'll be running, and since we won't be running any planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight to our land base. Quickly running down our mana lands, we'll of course be slotting in Command Tower and Savage Lands to give us easy access to all 3 of our colors. Exotic Orchard as another untapped way to get us access to most, if not all, of our colors off our opponent's lands. The Battle Lands Cinderglade and Smoldering Marsh, as well as the Check Lands Dragon Skull Summit, Rootbound Crag, and Woodland Cemetery, which function as duals that can take advantage of our basics to come into play untapped, with the former 2 also being fetchable by our non-basic land ramp sources for added consistency. Tainted Peak and Tainted Wood as even more untapped 2-color fixing that makes use of all the land ramp we have access to reliably get them online with our swamps. And lastly, Haunted Mire and Sheltered Thicket to give us another pair of fetchable duals to improve our consistency just a smidge more. And lastly, we'll be running 8 swamps, 5 mountains, and 11 forests as our basics to close out our land base with. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 33 cards that care about our graveyard, 27 cards that can set up our graveyard via self-mill or graveyard tutoring, 13 cards that can recur or reanimate cards from our graveyard, and 11 creatures who can derive power from cards in our graveyard, giving us a very potent graveyard-centric game plan for Coram and us to take advantage of, as well as 3 cards with base plus 10 power and 4 cards that care about our creature's power, so we can both give Coram a massive power boost without having to build up our graveyard first, while also generating value from our high power creatures and scalable power creatures as they come down. For general deck stats, we have 14 ramp sources, 3 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, our natural draw being well below average in this build, but this is due to most of our card advantage being generated from our graveyard to better synergize with Coram's game plan. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.42, leaving us with a mid-weight curve whose primary play pattern is to get Coram out as quickly as possible, and then start aggressively milling ourselves to fill up our bin as much as we can, both to empower him with our creatures from the grave and to enable him to let us play our lands and cast our spells from the bin each turn. Then from there, it's just a matter of us building up our graveyard more and more, empowering both Coram and all our other graveyard stat-deriving creatures, and then recurring/reanimating those creatures again and again, along with the occasional naturally high power creature if the opportunity presents itself, until our opponents are crushed under the relentless assault of our graveyard-empowered army. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.69, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we'd like to make some side grades to this deck without going over budget, we can consider exchanging out Underrealm Lich and Combustible Gear Hulk in favor of Soul's Majesty and Rishkar's Expertise if we'd like to add more traditional draw to the build that takes advantage of our high power creatures, thereby making us less reliant on our graveyard for resources if we're encountering a lot of graveyard hate, and perhaps swap Jarad Golgari Lich Lord for Chandra's Ignition if we'd rather have one less graveyard stat scalable creature to crack in or to empower Coram with, so we can instead have another board wipe that cares about our creature's power and can still deal heavy burn to all our opponents to help us close out games. Then if we'd like to upgrade this deck by going over budget, we can trade out Necrogoyf for Malignus, which on its own provides a staggering 20 power to Coram from the grave so long as we keep one of our opponents untouched while we deal with the others. We can cut Deadbridge Chant for Breach the Multiverse, which still mills us for 10 to set up our bin and provides much more immediate value with its AoE reanimation to instantly build up our board with both our and our opponents' most dangerous deceased creatures and walkers. And we can swap out Satyr Wayfinder for Life from the Loam, which we can easily get back into our hand if we mill it over via its dredge to get more cards into our bin, and we can then get it right back into the bin by recurring lands from our bin back to hand to be used again, which in turn provides even more mill and can overflow our hands so we can pitch cards we'd rather have in our bin when we discard down. And finally, if we don't mind digging a bit deeper into our graveyard and into our pockets, we can exchange out Cemetery Tampering in favor of Entomb, which for a single mana can get us any card we may need from our deck directly into our graveyard, making it the ultimate source of graveyard setup to enable all our graveyard-centric payoffs, with the added benefit of not being so bank-breakingly expensive that we have to bury our wallet alongside the card we tutor for. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, first things first, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for being patient for the release of this video. There have been quite a few things going on in my life that required my immediate attention, and while it is nothing serious, it was something that was more or less of a time sink, so unfortunately that meant that I could not put out content as frequently as I previously did. Now, hopefully, everything has been taken care of, so that means I should be coming back to the channel full-time with the weekly releases as you folks have grown accustomed to, starting with the first impressions alongside Caprak for the upcoming Bloomburrow Commander decks. That, however, does kind of leave the Necroblossom, who won the previous poll before I went on hiatus, in a precarious situation here. I'll do my best to get this built and released at some point in the next few weeks, but depending on time constraints, that may not be possible, so sorry in advance if it turns out that I have to leave this one on the cutting room floor. Otherwise, yeah, thank you all again for being patient and understanding. Remember to pay tribute to the almighty algorithm by liking, commenting, and subscribing if you like this content, so more folks can see it. Or if you really like the content and would like to keep me caffeinated directly, you can do so via either my Buy Me a Coffee or my Game Nerds affiliate links in the description as well. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.